from me, Gary Robinson, your host for this very special ACE Aware Nation conversation. And we're talking international perspective on ACEs. And we've got two wonderful guests giving us their perspectives from different parts of the globe, I'm delighted to say. Elizabeth Perry is the energy behind ACEs Canada, which was launched in 2020. And I'll ask Elizabeth to tell more about herself in just a moment or two. So not too much of a preamble. And Marianne Vanderveen-Kolkena.
Almost.
Almost is the energy behind ACE Aware Netherlands, which also launched in 2020 and is also partnered by Victor. And we'll find out a little bit more. Victor's not on the call with us tonight, but we'll find out a little bit more.
He's in the audience. He's in
the audience. Well, he's in the audience, so that is good to know. Victor, hello and welcome. It's good to know that you're there with us tonight. Thank you so much, or indeed today. Elizabeth, you're in Canada, big country. Whereabouts are you in Canada?
So I have to acknowledge that I am positioned on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq people in Mi'kma'ki. So you would understand that as being Nova Scotia. So I'm on the East Coast, and I'm originally from sort of Ontario, lived many years in British Columbia. So I'm kind of a pan-Canadian.
A pan-Canadian indeed. That's great. It's great to have you here
thank you so much.
Today. Thank you so much. And Marianne, what sort of score out of 10 do I get for the pronunciation, how I pronounced your wonderful name?
Yeah.
It's going to be one of those nights.
The Vanderveen was perfect. The Vanderveen was perfect.
Okay.
Yes.
7 out of 10, 8 out of 10.
Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, we'll go with it. Well, it's wonderful to have you in the Netherlands. Can we pinpoint where you are?
Well, the Netherlands is a small country. I'm in the north. It's called Assen, and I studied in Amsterdam for 4 or 5 years. So this is where Victor became my co-founder based on our shared studies as medical anthropologists. And so we travel to and fro. We're not around the corner from one another, but thanks to all the digital technology, we can be in touch because he's from Romania, actually. So we were working on ACE Aware blogs while he was there and I was here in the Netherlands. So thanks to all this technology, we can also now share you for the evening with you. So yeah.
Isn't it amazing, Marianne, how the adversity of COVID has made the world an awful lot smaller and an awful lot more accessible. I tend to have these conversations every day with all sorts of people in all sorts of organizations, but it really has really it's made the new form of communication much more rapid, and the world has become much more smaller, which is allowing conversations like this to happen, crucial and important conversations to happen as well. Elizabeth, can I just find out a little bit more about you and your interest in ACEs? How did it come about?
So in 2014, I read the book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And interestingly enough, at that same time, I remember I was going through some really, really tough times personally, and I was seeing my psychologist regularly. I keep him on retainer, but I don't see him all the time. But I was at that point in my life seeing him on a regular basis because I was really trying to, sort of stabilize my intervention. And during conversations with him, he just said to me, well, you might want to look into the ACE study. And it was interesting because I had just read that chapter in The Body Keeps the Score, but I never really connected with it. It just seemed like stuff I had read before and was aware of. My background, as my first career was in early childhood education. So I had all that child development training in the early 80s. So I kind of had an idea that, problems in childhood, manifest and carry through with you through adulthood. But I didn't really realize the extent to which that impact actually, sort of gets under our skin and actually into our cellular level. So when my psychologist pointed that out, I went back and I reread the chapter, and then I did the investigation, right? Like go to Mr. Google or Ms. Google and just find absolutely everything you can. And I found the ACE questionnaire, the 10 questions that Robert Anda compiled just to use for, sort of a quick and dirty self-reflective exercise. And I scored a 7. So I look at myself and I think, you're white, you're of a certain generation, maybe we grew up in poverty, but not really poverty. And, sort of teenage years, middle class, had a 2-parent family, even though my father was killed in a car accident when I was 13. So, there's all of these factors that would sort of look at me and say, well, how could you possibly have a 7? But realizing that I had a 7 helped me. It just provided me with this enormous relief that the problems that I had experienced in my adulthood, the intractable problems with relationships, right? How could they not have been? So that really gave me the opportunity to sort of think this information needs to get out there, because there's a lot more people like me than unlike me. And I believed at that time that information gave me a significant sense of relief and sense of empowerment. Like, to me, that was the missing piece in all the work that I had done over all the years, even with my education, with my own, sort of healthcare and going to psychiatrists and psychologists and all of that, right? This was the final piece to the puzzle that explained it. And so that's what motivated me to start talking about it. That was, 6.5 years ago. I haven't shut up since. And although I'm not always well received and people don't always, sort of welcome me to the table, in 2020, I said, frigate, I'm going to make my own table. And so I established ACES Canada and invite everybody to join me there.
Wonderful. Wonderful. We'll find out more in just a moment. Marianne, I'd like to ask you the same question, if I may. What inspired you, or what brought you to the ACES conversation?
Yeah. Vic and I discussed it this afternoon. When did we start? We sort of started, I think, December 2019, and then launched social media early 2020. And then Vic said, but you started in 1957. At a time I wasn't even born, so we were laughing about that. He meaning that I've been busy with this topic for ages, which is true somehow, because I'm a lactation consultant. So the core of our work as lactation consultants is physiology. We need to have our physiology straight, otherwise we cannot understand what mothers and babies go through in the breastfeeding process. So I kept reading and reading about physiology, and from a breastfeeding volunteer, I became a lactation consultant, and then from a lactation consultant, I decided I should maybe be a medical anthropologist. So because of ACES, I had not been studying at university after high school. So then finally 2014, I started studying. And one of the first lectures we had, we got to see the movie, The House I Live In. I don't know if any of you knows this film, but it's very impressive. And there appeared Gabor Mate stating, don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. And of this whole movie, this sentence stuck with me, and it led to me diving into all this stuff related to this, and of course looking him up on the website, on the internet. And it fitted in with a book that I had read years and years before, and it was called in Dutch, I translate to English now, the use or the meaningfulness of being ill. And in this book, it was described how psychological issues turn into physical issues if you neglect them long enough. And interestingly, I got this book as a gift from our next door neighbors at the time, and they were both registered nurses. And I was so surprised because in a biomedical setting, you will not expect people to look at health and disease like that. So there's been this interest for a long time, and I realized while I was studying more and more regarding breastfeeding and physiology, that probably my own sister died of ACEs, although I didn't know the word yet then. But I would say a broken heart because of everything that she missed out on. And the difficult marriage of my parents, and then realizing that probably my mom brought a lot of ACEs into their marriage, and on and on and on. So once you, as we discussed in the preamble, once you see it, you can no longer unsee it and not know it. And more and more things started to become clear to me. And so I decided I wanted to do something with this, but I had been doing so many more or less controversial projects on my own that I didn't want to do this by myself because I felt I would not be able to do it by myself. And then Vic and I discussed this, and he showed an interest, and well, that was it. I thought if he's going to join me, I feel encouraged to start this, and we can do this together.
The rest is
history.
Early history, as we say. Elizabeth, both your and Marianne's story there in the first 5 minutes of the program have been incredibly powerful, incredibly honest, and incredibly open. You talked about, Elizabeth, in your opening there about not being invited to the table, which is a really interesting. So you thought you would build your own, which takes a tremendous amount of courage and resilience. Why do you think that is? Is it, why do you get sometimes pushback when you look to promote ACEs or becoming, wanting Canada to become an ACE-aware nation?
Well, interestingly enough, I would say I'm going to quote a couple of people, right? Nadine Burke-Harris and also Lisa Cherry, if she's on the line here. Both reflected to us and, to me in conversation, it's too close, right? We don't want to talk about it because it's too close. It's not that it's unfamiliar to us. It's too familiar to us. We're actually more embedded in a personal ACEs experience than we're actually aware of and that we're ready to face. But I think, as a white, senior, that this is our opportunity. And it's our responsibility, right? We've inherited and we've contributed to the creation of a humanity that is in a state now where we are destroying our own environment because we're so disconnected from it, right? So we're destroying our environment, and a lot of us are destroying ourselves as well, right? And it's this perpetuation of these old, self-images, right? That I believe stem from colonial consciousness. And for me, it's we as, white people, and that's the other point out of the original ACE study that I think is often underemphasized. That population in that original ACE study was primarily white, middle-class, advantaged people. So it's us that need to look in the mirror. We are it's our population that sort of took over the world and decided to tell the world how everybody else needed to live. And yet look at what we've created as a humanity. And as a species. So I also think it's our responsibility to sort of take responsibility for ourselves and start processing our own stuff so that we can stop, continuing to create problems for other people, but that we can also free ourselves. It's so freeing when we realize it's not that there's something wrong with me. It's that something happened to me. And as Bruce Perry said, and there was nobody there to mitigate it.
Elizabeth, tell me a little bit about the schooling system in Canada, because as I was doing some research on this, it is very different to what we experience here in the United Kingdom, and I'm sure it's very different to a certain extent for the Netherlands. So tell me a little bit about the schooling system. I'm really intrigued about the terminology of First Nation children as well. So can you just give us a little bit of background as to what the schooling system in Canada looks like?
Okay, so typically we have a public school system and education is under the jurisdiction of the provinces. So it'll look a little bit different across the country. There's no sort of federal governing body, but for the most part, we have a public school system. Within that public school system, unfortunately, there's different funded settings. And so, folks who live in lower socioeconomic communities will have fewer resources. They won't have the best qualified teachers. They won't have extra resources. And so the children who are receiving their publicly funded education in lower socioeconomic community, advantaged communities are going to receive less quality education, which is ridiculous. But it's just the way sort of the systems are set up, right? But what you're referring to, and I have to acknowledge, I am not Indigenous. I am an ally. I have benefited greatly from Indigenous sort of the Indigenous worldview, Indigenous spirituality, Indigenous friends, colleagues. I'm so thankful. I actually would not be here if it were not for having that Indigenous perspective available to me when I was recovering from my spiritual abuse, right? But up until 1996, and sort of prior to that, from the dawn of Canada itself, Indigenous children were taken from their families, taken from their communities, and they were institutionalized in residential schools. And the purpose of that was to assimilate the Indian children into sort of colonial culture, right? So they're going to remove the Indian from the children, right? So this is the sort of the civilization practice, right? We're going to civilize the savages. And for over 100 years, that, and again, don't quote me, you'd have to speak to an Indigenous person about that, but this is just my perspective as an outsider. The effects of that continue to impact the Indigenous communities, the Indigenous individuals, but also sort of the ruling class's consciousness, right? It's hard for sort of I'm just going to delineate it, right? It's hard for the white people who are descendants and who are benefiting from that type of practice to acknowledge that we actually contributed to the harm that the Indigenous peoples of Canada, both the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, continue to try to free themselves of. And so Indigenous people are overrepresented in the carceral system. They're overrepresented in with sort of maybe not so much anymore, but in the past, in addictions. Indigenous children are still overrepresented in the foster care system, in the care experience, right? I mean, we have people who are, and maybe they're not doing it anymore, but that's a recent thing in the last couple of weeks, even in some jurisdictions, where if a mother was going to give birth to a baby, there was an alert put on her name. And as soon as she arrived at the hospital, her child was taken as soon as that child was born and taken into the care system because she was labeled unable to properly care for her child. But if we're not accepting accountability for the impacts that we have caused for the first peoples of this territory that we now call Canada, and if we're not providing wraparound services to all young mothers, then we're still accountable. And I think this is where the opportunity is for us to look in the mirror, face our own demons, realize that, it's just socialization. It's not real. It's not, something that we need to perpetuate. It's not something we need to protect. We can move on from it, and we need to move on from it if we're going to get to that point of equality, equity, shared humanity.
I don't think the audience saw me, but I think you could have seen me, and maybe Marianne, because my jaw dropped at certain parts of your story there. And so it's just to summarize all that wonderful information that you gave us there, Elizabeth. Education is almost like depending on where you are, a little bit like a postcode lottery, depending on the quality and the level of education that you receive. But also there seems to be some pushback and some shame about what's gone on previously. Am I picking that up correctly?
I'm not, I'm not the best person to tell you about the education system, right? Mm-hmm. But, I know when I was doing my master's in education, one of the things that, sort of made my jaw drop was the fact that in different sectors of society, you get a different level quality, a different quality of education, right? And I mean, I know that the children who are attending the schools in some of the less advantaged, and I'm just going to call it, in some of the regions where non-white children are being educated, that they just don't have the same resources offered into their schools, into their communities. So they don't have the same opportunities that, a child in maybe a more affluent section of the, sort of the area or, that particular subdivision or whatever, right? That they just are not going to have the same level of education. So it is very tiered.
Can I chime in with this, Gary?
Yeah, please do.
Yes. Yeah. You ask why do things not change, or why is it so difficult to get this knowledge across? If we look at how people achieve prestige, we can think of several things. As the sociologist Bourdieu would say, you have economic capital, like money or things you have. You have cultural capital, knowledge about how you should go through your daily things, and you shake hands with people. Well, okay, not now, but normally you would do in many cases. You have social capital, like the networks you are in, the people you know, the people that know you. You also have a fourth one, it's called symbolic capital, and it's the prestige you have. So the degree to which something you say is accepted as valid and legitimate. If that symbolic capital is overused or abused, one would say, we call it symbolic violence. And the thing is that I think there are many situations where people use symbolic violence. And a core aspect of symbolic violence is that people consider it the normal status quo, the normal way of how things are. So that a doctor or a policymaker or a politician has more power or has more prestige in the things they say is sort of accepted as the normal situation. So as soon as you come in with what we can call, there's a scientist who wrote a beautiful article about this. It's called uncomfortable knowledge. So it's knowledge that will disrupt the status quo on the one hand, but on the other hand, is also very, very uncomfortable to deal with. And the other aspect is that if you do not use this uncomfortable knowledge, you will have damage as well. So it's sort of a catch-22. What do? Do you heed that knowledge, which is very uncomfortable? Or do you ignore it or neglect it willfully or not willfully, unconsciously, out of fear or shame or guilt or whatever? You know that there's going to be damage as well. And I think ACEs are an example of a territory where we have a lot of uncomfortable knowledge, because if we have to reflect on what causes this deep sense of insecurity in children, we have to look at ourselves. And our colleague Aspa and Vic and I, we noticed this in an article we were trying to get published last week. They asked us, what does the ACE Aware movement have to add to movements like the first 1,000 days? So, great question. So we thank them for the question. We thank the editors for the question and for the opportunity for us to explain. So we added stuff to our article, but then we got to the uncomfortable stuff. And then in the next round, that was edited out again. And then we edited it again, and then it was edited out again. So we tried different wordings, different descriptions, different ways of explaining, but clearly it was so uncomfortable and fairly new as well that they felt that it did not fit in. Because what happens if we have to reflect, people get into not a compassionate mode usually, but into a guilty mode and a shame mode. And one of my recent interviewees, Jets, she's also in the audience, I noticed, she had a beautiful word, and I had some conversations about it with Elizabeth as well, and several other people in the community in Scotland, about how de-guiltifying it is, Jet said, to explain to people that the way they use their coping strategies is not an innate characteristic of their personality, but something they got used to survive. As Gabor says, don't blame yourself for your coping strategies, because they brought you where you are now and you were still alive, and now you have to heal from them. But therefore, again, you need a safe environment, a secure environment, an environment where you feel you are heard and seen and accepted with all your authenticity. And that is not always easy for people to find such an environment.
I just want to bring some, I had this view in my head, and it wasn't, Marianne, due to any particular knowledge that I had, but I had this assumption that parts of Europe, Netherlands in particular, were far more ahead of our thinking in terms of Scotland and the UK. But looking at some of your work and looking at some of the emails that I've read during the research for this, it appears to me, in your view, that the Netherlands, and this isn't a finger pointing exercise, but isn't as far as advanced as maybe somebody like me thought.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's always a matter of perspective, and it's always relative, of course. That I can very well imagine that there are situations where the position of children is much worse than it is here. And of course, there's always this. That's also a cultural, psychological thing, by the way. Do you look at what can still be improved, or do you look at where you've come from? And in certain situations, it's good to look back and say, hey, this is where I come from, and I've come a long way. On the other hand, if you stop there, you will not make any progress. So we have to keep looking at the things that do not go well. For example, breastfeeding rates being decreasing again here in the Netherlands. And also, I mean, at 6 months, it's only 20% or something. 20% of the babies that are still breastfed. Although we know that the important mother-baby relationship and the way it helps babies and mothers, by the way, to co-regulate, to look into each other's eyes, to build strong primary relationships, those are crucial for adult health. And there are so many things going on where we see that children have a lack of this experience. So what Elizabeth explained about all these power struggles, we've discussed this before. I often wonder whether white supremacy and male supremacy are not all rooted in what I have termed adult supremacy. The idea that I've given it a definition, but mainly it's the idea that the interests of the adult are always more important than the interests of the children. So if children would not be in a subordinate position in such an adult supremacy situation, they would be heard more and they would be able to develop this empathy. And with more empathy and more compassion, we would probably not have all these colonial abuse situations.
Elizabeth, if we can go back to Canada at the moment, where are you? Where is the grassroots movement in terms of its development? I know we looked at it being formed in 2020. What sort of impact are you and your colleagues having in Canada currently?
So let me just go back a little bit, right? Because I've been doing this for 6 years. And what I did was I just started ACES Canada. It was a Twitter handle first, and then I, registered it as a social enterprise in 2020. But I've been doing this work for 6 years. And it's really just started with trying to make contact with people, talking about this, like, did you hear about this? Talking to anybody and everybody that I could make, inroads with, right? So about 3 years ago, I was talking with Sissy White, who also might be on this call. And she was at the time was working with ACES Connection. And I said, I want to start a Canadian community on the ACES Connection site, which is centered in the US. And, sort of started as, perceived from the outside in, seemed to be a place where all of us could gather. And so I thought, well, I want to get this site put up. Now, at that time, another person, Canadian, had seen something I'd posted online there on that site. And she reached out to me, Denise Connors, who also might be on this call. And in conversation with Denise, it was like, well, would you like to co-host this Canadian site with me? So that's the 20th largest site on ACES Canada, on ACES Connection rather, and we have 440 members. There are over 1,400 people who are members of ACES Connection. And so obviously 1,000 of those are not members of our Canadian ACES and Trauma-Informed Network community on ACES Connection. But I also then have over, pushing 1,300 followers on my ACES Canada Twitter feed, which, I know has a lot of international interest, but that's, I set that up because I needed people to have a place where we could come, where we could meet, where we could share resources, where everyone was welcome to come and participate. So I have academics who engage with me. I have healthcare practitioners, doctors, social workers, very strong first voice engagement, but everybody's welcome to come to my table. And the reason I created my own table is because I have knocked over the last 6 years on so many doors. And usually when a community member comes to a table and says, I'd like to participate in the conversation too, somebody will squeeze their chair over and make room. That has not been my experience, right? It's been the exact opposite. And that to me has been shocking and demoralizing and frustrating, which is also why I reached out to the international community. And, I've often said the folks in Scotland and the interest and the support that you folks have given me has been the wind beneath my wings, because in a lot of ways it has felt, under a lot of circumstances that, I'm sort of on my own. I have a few people who, sort of engage, but I'm still, for the most part, sort of I'm the voice pulling it all together and, sort of connecting other people. Somebody else who has been, welcoming of me, thankfully, Nancy Ross, who is a researcher at Dalhousie for the last 2 or 3 years. I think when I first introduced myself to her, we've had some valuable engagement. And, she one time said to me, well, you're a community organizer. So it's like, oh, okay, I'm a community organizer. I can do that. I can wear that hat, right? So it's not so much that I'm producing content, but I'm still creating connections and gathering the network and trying to help people realize that we need to work together. We're a huge body of people who are concerned with mental health, with addiction, with justice, with social justice, with education, with social work, with healthcare, with academia. We're a huge body of people. And if we just got on the same page, we would be a political force. But we're so siloed, we're still competing for resources. So that's kind of the status of where we're at.
Marianne, do you find in your experience, looking at the globe and looking at different cultures, that ACEs is interpreted and absorbed in different ways? Does that make sense?
Well, not so long ago, I had a discussion about it with Suzanne with regard to a webinar I saw by Jane Mulcahy with Bruce Perry. And of course, people have different stances with regard to ACEs, and Bruce is not really a fan of the concept of ACEs. So I thought, let's watch this webinar and let's try and understand what he has against it. And I was perplexed because I listened intently and I could not see where the difference was, because I thought there was no contradiction really. But probably, as we discussed before, much is about how you frame things, the language you use, the way you translate things. Vic and I have this ongoing joke about being lost in translation. Well, we're not really much lost in translation anymore these days, but in the beginning, and I think there's a lot of translation going on at many levels. There is a translation from science into practice. There's a translation of experience into theory, and the other way around, theory into experience. There's a translation of when we observe people, of behavior into finding out what the underlying emotion and the underlying needs may be. So I think there's many levels, like micro, meso, macro, meta levels of translation. And the way we talk about it may be different, and it may depend on cultural habits or cultural views or words that do or do not fit well. Like for the independent care review, I was so touched when I watched Nicola Sturgeon held her speech in Parliament about the publication of the independent care review, and how she made a plea for using love and compassion with regard to child and youth healthcare and youth care. This is something that I have a really strong connection with language. I love language. I love writing. We have many, many blogs already on our website. And sometimes I write them in Dutch and translate them to English. Sometimes Vic or Asper writes them in English and I translate them to Dutch. So there's a lot of stuff there already, because writing allows people to read it at their own pace, in their own time. And it's also about addressing language in official documents. I've spent a lot of time over the last 10 years commenting on national guidelines for youth healthcare. And I'm often shocked about the words that are used there and how much power relations are emphasized, how much parents are encouraged to make clear to their children who's the boss. And I always wonder, is this something that parents want, or is this something that is so ingrained in our institutions that policymakers think they have to offer guidelines and tools for people to reconfirm certain power relations instead of reconsidering those power relations, and then maybe coming to a different conclusion that there is no power struggle between children and adults and parents. So language.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, in all the time that I've been doing these interviews around ACEs, and I always come at this from very much a layperson's angle. There's some language that's being shared tonight on this platform that I've never heard before. So things like the power struggle. So that might be new language to me, but it might mean something similar, but in Scotland or in the UK, but the language is slightly different. I want to go back to your policymaker point there, and it's really important. Do you feel that you're getting through to some policymakers? Are you starting to make an inroad? Are they listening? Are you starting to make a difference in the Netherlands?
Yeah, well, I wrote a statement against a guideline called the Parent-Child Relationship Guideline. Well, if there would somehow be a guideline related to ACEs, I would say the Parent-Infant Relationship Guideline. So it was published as a draft, and you could comment on it as a professional. So I requested to receive it. I received it. And I was at a loss for words, because I was so shocked to see how language from 10 years ago was repeated again. So I started to draw up an evidence-based statement. It turned into a 10-page document with 3 pages of references. And I managed to have about 10 co-signers, professors and people who have something to say in the Netherlands in this field. And I CC'd my email to this institution drafting this guideline, also to another 10 or 15 people. So really well-known names. And then we got a response, and I was very disappointed, but because to me it felt like nothing had really changed. And we got a letter: you wrote this, we feel that. You wrote this, we feel that. And Aspa was annoyed, and I was annoyed, and Vic was annoyed, and we said, how come? So we had another look at it, and I wanted to write an email back, like, can we maybe have a conversation with you as policymakers? But I felt I was still angry and annoyed, and I didn't want to write an email or a response that was filled with annoyed emotions. Because I feel the way we go through the process is part of the ACE awareness process. If we do not succeed in responding with compassion, we have no legitimacy of being an ACE-aware movement at all, because it's the core of the issue. So we sat down with our eldest daughter, Vic and I, and we had another look at it, and we looked at the response we got back. And our eldest daughter said, Mom, this is not a failure. They gave you a very long response, which is very exceptional for a government institution. And also, they have added a paragraph on ACEs. And I felt the paragraph on ACEs was not sufficient, but there was no paragraph on ACEs at first. And now there is. So where I saw failure, our daughter saw progress. But where I was appalled at the pace, she was aware of the slowness of processes at ministries and government institutions. So
Thank you for that. Elizabeth, you described you didn't call them frustrations, but I imagine the challenges that you have very clearly.
They're frustrations.
And frustration. Okay, I didn't want to put that word in your mouth.
No,
but how do you feel? Okay, how do you feel that you're currently making an impact with, same again, with policymakers in Canada? Are they slowly listening? Are they coming round, or do you continue to chip away at this?
You know what? It all depends on funding, right? Like what's being funded. So my work is not being funded, but other people's work is being funded, right? And what needs to happen more is that, sort of the funding needs to be directed into meaningful research, right? I too, Marianne, get disturbed when I hear Bruce Perry dissing ACEs, right? But he does emphasize that the best benefit for them is for self-reflection. And I totally agree with that, right? But but one point that he made, I think it was on an interview with Jane Mulcahy recently, was that the research needs now to be more specific, not just sort of broad about, replicating the ACEs data again over and over and over again, but that we need to now be more specific as to what happens when different things are happening. One of the things that I heard over the years is that, well, we can't talk ACEs because we don't have Canadian data. And then people would say, and then I found out that there was a little bit of research. As far as I know, there's been 5 studies. There may be 6 or 7, couple maybe that I don't know, maybe some in the hopper right now. But the one research study that should be done in Canada is we have a cohort of 300,000 Canadians who are participating already in a longitudinal study. And all those people have to do is complete the ACEs questionnaire, the resilience questionnaire. And now we already have all their health data. We already have their socioeconomic status. We already have their ACE. So all we have to do is just give them that ACE questionnaire and the resilience questionnaire. And now we have the largest ACEs population ACEs study in the world. But we need somebody to fund it. It needs to be important enough for that to happen. So I've really been pushing for that. And, the folks who are on my Twitter feed, I often will tag funders and make these kinds of comments. I've reached out to different, academics and, sort of proposed this or even just mentioned it. I'm not an academic myself, so I don't talk to academics on an academic level. I'm an outsider, right? I'm an outsider and I'm okay with that. But I also have some valuable perspective to contribute. And I also have some valuable, sort of talent and resources and connections that, I just want all of us to work together. And for me, those policy decisions are happening because we're getting the pressures from all different directions. But if we could all just work together, we'd have so much more power.
I suppose one of the
Can I say something about the funding?
Yes,
Gary?
yeah, of course.
Yeah. I agree, of course, with Elizabeth that all this work should be funded. And again, I sometimes also see it as a privilege, and I don't mean, of course, it's a sign of privilege if you don't have to work if you can stay alive without getting the salary for the work you do. I mean, but then again, I also see it as a privilege in a different meaning, in the sense that because I'm not paid by anyone, I don't have to repeat anyone's opinions. I'm independent in what I say. Vic and Aspa and I can decide what we want to put out there for the ACE Aware NL movement, because it's our opinion. And it's not, well, that's not correct. It's not our opinion. What we put out is based on all the research that is being done and on the lived experience of people that we talk to. And there are concepts like fierce compassion and Sue's fierce kindness. I remember Vic and I watching that webinar that Sue gave on fierce kindness. It was fantastic. And I think there's a lot of work we can do for a bottom-up movement. I saw James Doherty, who's also such a sweetheart, post a Twitter thing yesterday about rights are never handed out from above. They are created. Rights are not created by silence. I think I wrote it down. It was really good. Silence never won rights. They are not handed down from above. They are forced by pressures from below. And I love a statement like that, because it can also inspire you to keep going. Like some people say, just keep repeating. Not always do you know the impact of what you put out there. We put out our blogs. I had this great conversation with Jet, and we met last week because we wanted to catch up after the interview. And she said, stuff that you handed me, I already use in contact with my clients. So there is a ripple effect, even if you do not always see it. So we have to keep the faith somehow that what you do will never be for nothing, because somehow there are energies transporting this, even if you don't always know it. So yeah, that is what I see as a privileged part of not being funded by anyone whose opinion I have to replicate.
I think there's also a commonality in certain parts of language, and certainly I think one thing that the grassroots movement in Scotland has done successfully to this point is put relationships at the heart of the discussion.
Yes.
Is that something that you are replicating, looking to replicate? Think it would have, an impact if it changes the course of the conversation?
Well, I've been watching you for quite a while before we started to get anything going in the Netherlands. And we have a website now. We had a logo. We struggled with what we wanted to express with that logo. It now has all the 7 rainbow colors, because we feel that if you look at life in a salutogenic way, we wrote a blog on salutogenesis today again, will be published tomorrow morning. You look for those resources that allow you to flourish, to use your potential, because a really serious consequence of ACEs is the total underachievement of people, a loss of potential of all the things they could have done if they were not so hindered by their ACEs in childhood. So if you go on like that, if you watch one another doing this, and you use the knowledge you get from there, we created our pillars. Those are our 7 pillars, sort of combining with the 7 colors of the rainbow: connection, compassion, courage, curiosity, confidence, kindness, resilience. We try to use those all the time, to repeat them. I'm now reading Brené Brown's book, Dare to Lead. And there's, again, it's vulnerability, connection, compassion, courage, curiosity. All those concepts are so important. So we can learn a lot from one another, and that's wonderful.
Elizabeth, I did say before we started this that this hour would go very quickly, and it has. We've got a few minutes left. Is it time, and would it help Canada if there was more of a global ACEs movement?
Well, it certainly helps me get my message across and get ACEs, get them that credibility, like just some of the things I've heard, right? Oh yeah, we've drank the ACEs Kool-Aid. You don't use that expression ever. It's minimizing the coerced suicide of 941 individuals.
Yep. And
this is from somebody who is a leader in child advocacy in Canada. Many, many times, no, you can't talk about that because we don't want you creating a problem. We don't want you creating need. So I would benefit from there being a global movement, right? Because the other piece I want to bring in, there are good educational resources that have been developed in Canada. I highly recommend, if you can do it, and just obviously do it at your own pace, and don't believe when they say it's only 20 hours. It's going to take you for a long time if you're not a neuroscientist in the beginning. But I highly recommend that everybody access the Brain Story. It's been produced by the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative, and it takes us right from conception and the development of the brain from a neuroscientific perspective, the development of the brain all the way up to including ACEs and the impacts of those, but also, sort of the effect on addiction and relationships and, sort of families and society at large, right? But that particular level of education is not necessary. That organization built or created a number of really accessible videos. Those videos should be broadcast on the main television networks in Canada on a regular basis. Somebody should be funding that information being broadcast in Canada. If we're really going to make the substantive changes that we need to make in the lives of Canadian children, we need the grassroots to get on board. But there's been this knowledge protectionism. It's kept within the ivory towers. Somebody like me coming along and saying, I'm first voice, I want to be part of this table, but no, you're not allowed to be part of this table because you're not a healthcare worker and you're not a social, sort of a social worker, right? So, I mean, we need this information to get out exactly like how it's happening in Scotland, right? The Scotland people themselves are realizing for themselves, in my view, right, as an outsider, that this is important and you're pushing it and you're driving the political change. Yeah. But what's happened in Canada is it started from the top down and there's still these barriers. But that information needs, like, when it's accessible to people that are directly impacted, they figure out ways of using it to their healthy advantage, right? So this business of keeping the knowledge locked away is inappropriate.
I agree that to some extent it's inappropriate. And again, I think part of this whole awareness is also in ourselves to try and see that keeping knowledge to yourselves is probably a sign of ACEs. So,
that's my whole thesis.
I'm constantly trying to train myself and to turn this into a mantra. Whenever something like this happens, there's probably trauma there. Otherwise, they would not have to be so defensive. So it's not easy, but I have come to perceive this change in myself, that I am more and more easily able to look at situations where I would have been totally annoyed before. I now think, interesting, what's going on there? This curiosity that Gabor also always talks about, and that Suzanne talks about. I think this is part of the thing, that we have to be compassionately curious to find out why this uncomfortable knowledge is not being shared.
Okay, so
I get that, but yeah. I get that. Yeah.
Very briefly as we wrap up, it was interesting as well, because I think there's so much that's happened. Particularly, I talk from a Scotland UK perspective. We know that Dr. Suzanne Zeedijk and Pauline Scott, I think, were instrumental in getting resilience on a British TV channel. Maybe it's a discussion to be had, with their very final question and snappy answers, if you don't mind, ladies. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. Marianne, is it now time for more international collaboration when it comes to ACEs?
I would love to. I'm trying to all the time. Yeah. Is that snappy enough?
It's wonderfully snappy. I love it. I actually feel quite rude saying that to you now, Marianne, but it was wonderfully snappy. And Elizabeth, something like an international, because this technology now has made our world smaller and more accessible. Something along the lines of an ACEs global gathering. Is that the sort of thing you would welcome?
Oh, I would totally welcome that. And you guys are doing so well with that. And thank you so much for including us in this conversation, but also for just engaging on Twitter for the last 3 years, right? Yeah. I mean, we've created this, those of us who've participated have already created this international community. I mean, I think of, Angie Yoder-Mena in Kenya, and Adriana Alvorst in New Zealand, and, Tracy Farrell in Australia. And, we have this global community of people who are talking ACEs and really getting to the root causes of our human issues, which are causing our environmental issues.
But nothing beats personal contact, Gary, because I've had several interviews recently, and I said, I don't want to do them online. I just want to see you, look you in the eye, and
Yeah.
be together, because nothing beats that.
I agree. I agree. But I think, as Elizabeth said to me before we went live, it will be what it will be. I thought that was I thought that was the line of the night.
Well,
You've both been absolutely wonderful, and please, don't lose the passion, and don't lose. And I'm sure you want the voices that you are quite clearly demonstrating and making a difference. It might be not as quick as you like from what you've said. There may be some frustrations, but without your voices, a difference will not be made in your countries or indeed the world. Marianne, it's been an absolute pleasure and an honor. Elizabeth, exactly the same. Thank you so much.
Back at you, Gary.
Likewise. Thank you.
At you.
Yes.
We are back
Who
on
would have thought that I would ever be interviewed by the famous Gary Robinson?
Behave yourself. I'm blushing. We'll be back on the 24th of March, and we'll be looking at relational leadership. Forgive me, and we'll be raising awareness of relationships, trauma, and ACEs in business, of all things. And we'll be speaking to two business leaders who'll be sharing their insights and their thoughts as well. Thank you to our international audience. As always, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us. As I always say, remain safe. Self-care, plenty of it, and look after yourselves and your loved ones. From me, Gary Robinson, and the whole ACE Aware Nation Conversation team. We'll see you on the 24th of March. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right.